Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Armenia is taking further step towards closer ties with the European Union, with the country's Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, saying Yerevan could formally apply for EU membership in the near future, while indicating that Armenia will not resume active participation in the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. Meanwhile, Armenia's former president, Robert Kochinyan, has been detained on corruption charges amid a wider debate over the country's domestic and foreign policy direction. And joining us now is Raffi Elliott, political risk analyst at Caucasus Signal Advisory, to discuss it further. Good to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
All right, so this now signal from the Prime Minister of Armenia, does this come as a surprise? And what does he mean, do you think, by saying this will be in the near future?
Does it come as a surprise? No. I was actually part of Pashinyan's electoral platform going into the June 2026 parliamentary election, which they won with slightly under 50% of the vote. They actually had mentioned that their plan for EU realignment was actually rather nebulous, to be honest, because it also mentioned alignment with EU regulations and EU membership criteria, quote, as long as they're compatible with Armenia's Eurasian Union compatibility. So this most recent statement yesterday just kind of continues in that line of directing Armenia's foreign policy towards eventual EU membership without giving a direct timeline other than very soon.
Yeah, and this is something we've seen, and we know there have been senior politicians from the EU there in Yerevan just some months ago, so this has been building up. But at the same time, what about the argument to say that this is something he wanted to diversify, sort of playing both sides, also still with Russia to some extent, but also with Europe? Is this now more clear? Is Armenia moving very much only into that direction of Europe?
So balancing East and West has been Armenia's foreign policy since independence in 1991. So in that sense, he's actually following a long line of foreign policy thinkers in Armenia. However, what's different is exactly what you just said, is that there's actually a very clear intent now for distancing Armenia from the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union, which Armenia is a founding member of, and a much more direct and objective overture towards EU membership. As you've also alluded to, of course, Armenia's biggest hurdle to that is the fact that Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which Russia kind of strong-armed Armenia into joining back in 2013 in much the same way as it later tried and failed with Ukraine, which led to the Maidan revolution. So the main issue is that they're both separate customs unions. Back in the early 2010s, there was this idea in the regional geopolitics that there would be an integration of integration, meaning that the Eurasian Economic Union, which was led by Russia, would help standardize the economies of a lot of these former Soviet countries, and then later somewhat integrate into the European Union. So it seemed like it was less of a convergence of issues back then, but right now they are both very incompatible customs unions, and Armenia eventually will have to make a very deliberate choice if it wants to apply for EU membership.
Mm-hmm. Incompatible, that's also something, an interesting choice of word. That's what Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, said, and basically warning, saying that Armenia cannot be in both the Eurasian Union, that you said they were strong-armed into, and also pursue that membership of the European Union. Now, Putin has said Armenia would lose, 14% of its GDP if it moves itself away from that. So what kind of coercion, or even, let's say, leverage does Moscow have at this point for preventing Armenia from doing anything?
So that's right. I mean, the Russian Federation is currently Armenia's #1 trade partner, followed closely by the European Union. But that still means that a lot of the products that Armenia produces, many of which still have a certain cachet and name recognition in the market of the former Soviet Union, are essentially what gets imported into Russia, things that will be much harder for Armenia to sell in the European market because of broader competition and less name recognition for Armenian products, like Armenian wines, for example, will have to compete with with French and Italian wines. There are other forms of leverage that Russia has. Historically, of course, there was the defense aspect of it, in which Russia had both bilateral and other types of treaties that guaranteed Armenia's protection. However, those have, as we've discussed many times in the past on this show, those have greatly diminished when Russia was basically unable to fulfill its commitments, largely due to its disinterest in the region and, of course, its involvement in its invasion of Ukraine. But there are also up to 2 million Armenians who live in Russia. At least half of those are Armenian citizens, many of whom are in Russia as part of the Eurasian Union's labor mobility arrangements, which could easily be changed. And of course, Russia has in the past and continues to threaten to simply nullify all of these people's visas and forcing Armenia to face a situation where hundreds of thousands of unemployed working-age men would be deported into the country. So those are two of the major ones, as well, of course, as the energy relationship that Russia maintains with Armenia, primarily in the form of exporting gas at supposedly Russian internal market prices, those all of which have been used as threats in the past 2 to 3 months by various figures in the Russian government. And in some cases, these threats have been acted upon. The Russian agricultural and food regulator has banned a number of Armenian agricultural products, including flowers, fruits, and the Jermuk mineral water, allegedly on health and safety violations, which have so far not been proven, and go against the very nature of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is supposed to be a free trade zone within the members.
Mm-hmm. And also just want to talk about geography for a second, because we just saw the map there. Armenia is right in the middle there. Georgia to the north, Azerbaijan landlocked east, Turkey to the west, Iran to the south. It doesn't border any EU member states right now. In fact, if we look at, Turkey, that's stalled completely. Georgia also stalled in terms of actual membership talks. But I'm just curious also about Russia's role here. I mean, we've also heard that last week more and more Russians are fleeing into neighboring Georgia and also Azerbaijan. I mean, that doesn't necessarily impact Armenia now, but potentially we could see Russians also escape into Armenia. If that happens, does that work to the detriment or advantage of Armenia in any way in all this?
Well, as you eloquently put it, Armenia is in a very interesting neighborhood. And to answer the other question, there actually are many Russians who have been fleeing to Armenia, at least over the last 3 or 4 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Up to 100,000 Russian nationals have moved to Armenia, in some cases temporarily, in other cases they seem to have stayed, opened businesses and so on. Many tech companies in particular have moved with office and employees and families all together into Armenia. And there are the country is bracing for another increase in Russian refugees, if you will, into Armenia, with expectations that there may or may not be a further mobilization in the Russian Federation come September. Already, real estate prices have been going up due to market speculation, and hotel bookings seem to have also gone up. So this is definitely something that Armenia is bracing for. And Armenia's former Speaker of the House, Alen Simonyan, just yesterday gave an interview to Dozhd, or TV Rain, which is Russia's sort of liberal opposition TV channel, in which he actually explicitly mentioned that Russians who are trying to escape the regime in Moscow are welcome to settle in Armenia, and that the Armenian government would create no hurdles for them if they were to try to escape through Armenia as a route. So it is something that Armenia is actually acutely aware of and planning for. Now, how will that affect relations with Russia? That's a very good question, because that relationship also goes both ways. Many of these Russians are also involved in sanction busting types of businesses, in which various consumer goods, which are now no longer available in Russia, have been entering Russia through Armenia because of the Eurasian Economic Union. And Russia, of course, is aware of this and will be treading lightly when trying to deal with the situation, since Russia does need Armenia, despite the fact that it doesn't like to admit it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so exactly on that, if more Russians do seek refuge in Armenia, I mean, you said that's already been happening for some time. If another flood does indeed come, that gives, in some sense, then Armenia, let's say, more leverage here. I mean, it becomes sort of more strategic. Maybe will that maybe help out Pashinyan? What other things he needs in future, potentially?
That will absolutely be part of the calculus for Armenia. Of course, as several Russian officials, including former President Medvedev, pointed out, that if Armenia is serious in its attempt at pursuing EU membership, we're talking about a process that will last years, if not decades, because even once formal membership requests are submitted, the EU has 6 clusters as part of the negotiation package, specifically in terms of joining the Copenhagen criteria, which is the EU's way of noting that Armenia meets the requirement of being a democratic, rule of law European state. And then these 6 clusters are actually divided into 35 chapters. Now, of course, God knows how long that will take. Some countries like Iceland could probably close all chapters in a matter of 1 to 2 years. But Montenegro, for example, which has applied for EU membership at least 10 years ago, is currently still negotiating Chapter 27. So it's really a matter, which means that it puts Armenia in a vulnerable position in which it may be kicked out of the Eurasian Union, and whatever benefits it may have had of it will be lost, while not enjoying an immediate guarantee of EU membership. So this is something that Armenia needs to tread very carefully on. Of course, the government seems to be aware of that, which is why much of the language that Pashinyan uses always mentions alignment with EU regulations or membership criteria without losing compatibility with the Eurasian Union. Right. It is not that easy for Russia to kick out Armenia. Armenia is a founding member and it has voting rights. So Armenia still controls that aspect of the negotiations. So
still a very delicate catwalk there, but it does seem that Pashinyan has his sights set more on European alignment. We'll analyze it for another time, I'm sure. Thanks so much, Raffi Elliott there. Thanks so much for all your insights today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
And thank you for watching World Talks, but do stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.